Imagine a single company so valuable that it dwarfs Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. A company that pumps out more revenue in a single quarter than most nations generate in a year. A company that for decades was owned and operated not by the country sitting on top of its oil, but by a handful of American corporations based thousands of miles away in boardrooms scattered across New York and San Francisco. That company is Aramco. And the story of how it came to exist is not a story about geology or engineering. It is a story about empire, about quiet conquest, and about one of the most consequential geopolitical relationships of the modern era. Because beneath the sand dunes of the Arabian Peninsula lies roughly 17% of the world's proven petroleum reserves. And for the better part of a century, the nation that controlled access to that oil was not Saudi Arabia. It was the United States of America. This is the story of how America quietly took over Saudi Arabia's oil and why even after the Saudis technically took it back, the architecture of that original bargain has never truly been dismantled. To understand how this all began, you need to understand the world as it looked in the early 1930s. The Great Depression had shattered economies on both sides of the Atlantic. Global trade had collapsed. Empires were fracturing. And in the Arabian Peninsula, a warrior king named Abdulaziz ibn Abdulrahman al Saud had just completed the unification of a vast desert territory that he would name after his own family, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, declared in 1932. But unification did not bring prosperity. The new kingdom was desperately poor. Its primary source of income came from taxing pilgrims making the annual Hajj to Mecca, and even that revenue was drying up because fewer people could afford the journey during a global depression. Abdulaziz needed money and he needed it fast. He had no industry, no infrastructure, no modern economy to speak of. What he had was sand, and what lay beneath it was still unknown. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, American oil companies were in a state of quiet panic. The First World War had demonstrated something terrifying to military strategists and industrialists alike, that modern warfare ran on petroleum, tanks, battleships, aircraft, trucks. The entire machinery of 20th century combat depended on a steady supply of oil. And by the early 1920s, there was a growing fear inside the United States government that America's own domestic reserves might not be enough. The concern was sharpened by a diplomatic humiliation. In 1920, Britain and France had signed what was called the San Remo Petroleum Agreement, which effectively carved up access to the oil fields of the former Ottoman territories, specifically in what is now Iraq, and locked American companies out entirely. The British already controlled oil in Persia through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the predecessor to what we now know as BP. They controlled oil in Iraq through a consortium that American firms were excluded from, and they were eyeing the Persian Gulf with obvious intent. The American government, under pressure from its own oil industry, pushed back hard. Herbert Hoover, who was then the Secretary of Commerce, championed what was called the open door policy, demanding that American companies be given equal access to oil concessions in the Middle East. It was framed as a matter of principle, free trade, equal opportunity, but in practice it was raw economic warfare. America was not going to sit back and watch Britain monopolize the most strategically important commodity on the planet. This is the backdrop against which Standard Oil of California, known as SoCal, entered the picture. SoCal was one of the descendants of John D. Rockefeller's original Standard Oil empire, broken up by the Supreme Court in 1911 into 34 separate companies. Even after that breakup, these companies were still enormous, still aggressive, and still looking for new reserves around the world. In 1932, a SoCal subsidiary called the Bahrain Petroleum Company struck oil on the small island nation of Bahrain, just off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. It was the first major oil discovery in the Persian Gulf outside of Iran, and it immediately raised a question that would change the world. If there was oil in Bahrain, then what about the vast unexplored landmass sitting right next door? King Abdulaziz was being courted by two suitors. On one side was the Iraq Petroleum Company, which was essentially a British consortium. On the other side was SoCal, an American company. Now the British had a longer history in the region. They had treaties, military relationships, and colonial leverage throughout the Gulf. But Abdul Aziz was no fool. He had watched the British carve up the Middle East after the First World War. He had watched them draw borders that served London's interests, not Arabia's. He was suspicious of British motives, and for good reason. The British were not offering particularly generous terms. They wanted control, not partnership. SoCal, on the other hand, came with something different. It came with money up front, and it came without the baggage of colonial ambition. Or at least that is how it was presented. On May 29, 1933, Saudi Arabia's finance minister, Abdullah al-Sulayman, signed a concession agreement with a SoCal representative named Lloyd Hamilton. The terms were remarkably favorable to the Americans in exchange for an initial payment of $35,000 in gold, plus rental fees and small royalties on any oil found. SoCal received exclusive rights to explore for and produce oil across a vast swath of eastern Saudi Arabia. The concession covered an area roughly the size of Texas, and the agreement was structured to last 60 years. Think about that for a moment. A young kingdom, barely a year old, with no geological expertise, no drilling technology, and no leverage whatsoever, had just signed away the subsurface rights to an area the size of a major American state for less than the price of a modest house in Manhattan. The king knew he was getting a raw deal. He knew the terms were lopsided, but he also knew that even meager financial returns were better than no returns at all. His monarchy did not have the capital or the technology to find oil on its own. Without the Americans, the oil would simply stay in the ground, doing nobody any good. SoCal immediately created a subsidiary to manage the concession. They called it the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, or CASOC. American geologists and engineers arrived in the eastern province, setting up camp near a small town called Dhahran. It was blisteringly hot, remote, and inhospitable. The Americans lived in tents and prefabricated huts, drilling exploratory wells in the desert while enduring sandstorms and temperatures that could melt candle wax. For years, they found nothing. Well after well came up dry. SoCal was hemorrhaging money. By 1936, with no oil in sight, the company was getting nervous enough that it sold a 50% stake in the concession to the Texas company, which we now know as Texaco, for $21 million plus a share of Texaco's marketing facilities east of the Suez Canal. It was a hedge. If the whole venture turned out to be a dry hole, at least SoCal would have recovered some of its losses. But then on March 4, 1938, everything changed. A well-designated Damam number 7, drilled to a depth of nearly 1,140 meters on a limestone ridge called Jabal Dhahran, struck oil. And not just a trickle. This well immediately began producing over 1,500 barrels per day. It was commercial-grade crude, high quality, and it just kept flowing. The Americans realized they were sitting on something enormous. Damam number 7 would later be nicknamed the Prosperity Well, and it was just the beginning. Subsequent exploration would reveal that eastern Saudi Arabia was home to the largest conventional oil reserves ever discovered by human beings. The Gower Field alone, confirmed in the 1950s, would turn out to be the largest onshore oil field on the planet, producing roughly 3.8 million barrels per day at its peak, more than most entire countries. King Abdulaziz made his first official visit to the oil facilities in the spring of 1939. He arrived with a procession of more than 400 cars crossing the red sands of the Dana Desert to reach the eastern coast. He inspected the drilling operations, watched the crude flow through the newly built pipeline stretching 69 kilometers to the port of Ras Tanura, and inaugurated the route for the first tanker shipment of Saudi oil to the international market. It was a symbolic moment. The kingdom was no longer just sand and pilgrims. It was an oil state, but it was an oil state where the Americans ran everything. And this is the part of the story that often gets glossed over. The concession agreement was not just a business deal. It was a transfer of sovereign control over the most valuable natural resource in the kingdom. Article 23 of the original agreement stated, and I am paraphrasing the essence here, that the enterprise would be directed and supervised by Americans. Saudi nationals were to be employed where practicable, but the operational control, the decision-making, the profits, and the strategic direction of the entire oil operation belonged to the American companies. The Saudis were in effect landlords collecting rent, while American tenants ran a business worth billions out of their basement. When the Second World War broke out, the oil fields became strategically critical. The Axis powers made multiple attempts to disrupt American access to Arabian oil. German submarines prowled the shipping lanes. The threat was real enough that President Franklin D. Roosevelt took a direct interest in ensuring that Saudi Arabia and its oil remained firmly within America's sphere of influence. In 1943, Roosevelt declared Saudi Arabia eligible for Lend-Lease assistance, a program originally designed to supply allied nations fighting the Axis. Saudi Arabia was not fighting anyone, but it had oil, and that was enough. Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, went even further. He proposed that the federal government should establish direct control over all oil resources owned by American companies in Saudi Arabia, essentially suggesting that Saudi oil should be treated as a strategic asset of the United States government, not merely a commercial venture of private corporations. That proposal was ultimately rejected, but it reveals the mindset. In the eyes of senior American officials, Saudi oil was not Saudi Arabia's oil, it was America's oil located in Saudi Arabia. Then came the meeting that cemented everything. On February 14, 1945, Roosevelt, returning from the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin, made a secret detour to the Suez Canal. There aboard the USS Quincy, a heavy cruiser anchored in the Great Bitter Lake, he met King Abdulaziz for the first and only time. It was the first meeting between a sitting American president and a Saudi monarch, and it would set the foundation for one of the most consequential alliances in modern history. Abdulaziz had never left the Arabian Peninsula before. He had never been to sea. He arrived on a U.S. destroyer, the USS Murphy, with 48 companions including guards, servants, cooks, and an astrologer. He set up an Arabian tent on the destroyer's deck and led prayers for his entourage during the voyage. When the Murphy pulled alongside the Quincy, the king was greeted by Roosevelt, who was seated in his wheelchair on the deck. Roosevelt, paralyzed from the waist down since the age of 39, broke the ice by saying that the king was luckier because he could still walk. Abdulaziz replied, "No, my friend, you are the more fortunate because you ride in a chair with wheels, while I must ride upon the legs of an animal." The meeting lasted several hours. The official topic was the question of Palestine. Roosevelt trying to persuade the king to accept Jewish immigration, Abdulaziz firmly refusing. They disagreed sharply on that subject, and the king's position never wavered. But beneath the diplomatic pleasantries, the real substance was simpler and far more consequential. America wanted guaranteed access to Saudi oil. Saudi Arabia wanted guaranteed military protection. Neither side put it quite that bluntly, but both understood the exchange. Roosevelt assured the king that the United States would never take any hostile action against the Arab peoples, and that no decision regarding Palestine would be made without consulting both Arabs and Jews. In return, Abdulaziz assured Roosevelt that America's oil concession was safe, that no foreign power would be allowed to interfere with it, and that Saudi Arabia would remain within America's orbit. Roosevelt confirmed these assurances in a letter dated April 5, 1945, just 1 week before his death. The letter was addressed to his great and good friend, and it repeated the promises made on the Quincy. Roosevelt died 7 days later. His successor, Harry Truman, would promptly break those promises by recognizing the State of Israel in 1948 without consulting the Saudis. But the oil bargain survived. It always survived because oil was more important than Palestine, more important than promises, more important than anything. In the years immediately following the war, the American oil operation in Saudi Arabia expanded at a staggering pace. In 1944, the company had been renamed from KSOC to the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco. In 1947, two more American oil giants bought into the venture. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which would become Exxon, purchased 30%, and Socani Vacuum, which would become Mobil, purchased 10%. SoCal and Texaco each retained 30%. So by the late 1940s, Aramco was a consortium of four massive American corporations, all of them descendants directly or indirectly of John D. Rockefeller's original Standard Oil. The full circle of American oil power had been completed. The companies that Rockefeller built were now pumping Saudi Arabia's oil, and they were pumping a lot of it. By 1949, Aramco's crude oil production hit 500,000 barrels per day. In 1950, the company completed the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, stretching over 1,200 kilometers from eastern Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean coast, the longest pipeline in the world at that time. Built primarily by the American engineering firm Bechtel, the pipeline cut shipping times to Europe dramatically and turned Saudi Arabia into one of the most important energy suppliers on Earth. In 1951, Aramco discovered the Safaniya field, the world's largest offshore oil field. By 1958, daily production exceeded 1 million barrels. But even as the oil flowed and the profits soared, King Abdulaziz was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the arrangement. He watched as Venezuela, another major oil-producing nation, negotiated a 50-50 profit-sharing deal with Standard Oil of New Jersey and Royal Dutch Shell. Venezuela's oil minister, Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, had argued that the producing nation deserved at least half the profits from its own natural resources. It was a radical idea at the time, but it worked. And when word of the Venezuelan deal reached Riyadh, Abdulaziz asked a simple question: why are we getting less than the Venezuelans? By 1950, the king was openly threatening to nationalize Aramco's facilities unless a more equitable arrangement was reached. The threat was credible. Iran had nationalized its oil industry in 1951 under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, sending shockwaves through the global energy market, though the British and Americans would eventually overthrow Mossadegh in a CIA-backed coup. The Saudis were watching all of this very carefully. They understood that nationalization was possible, but they also understood the consequences. What happened next was one of the most ingenious financial maneuvers in the history of American foreign policy. A move so clever that it was later given the sardonic nickname, the Golden Gimmick. Rather than allow Aramco to simply hand over 50% of its profits to the Saudi government, which would have cut deeply into the American company's bottom line, the Truman administration arranged a foreign tax credit. The deal signed on December 30th, 1950 worked like this. Aramco would submit 50% of its profits to the Saudi government as an income tax. But because it was structured as a tax rather than a royalty, the American parent companies could claim it as a foreign tax credit on their U.S. tax returns, dollar for dollar. In other words, the money that went to King Abdulaziz came not from the oil companies' pockets, but from the United States Treasury. American taxpayers were, without knowing it, subsidizing the Saudi monarchy to prevent nationalization of what were technically Saudi natural resources being extracted by American corporations. The Golden Gimmick was kept secret for years. When it was eventually exposed, it sparked fierce criticism from policy experts and journalists who argued that the arrangement was nothing more than a covert government subsidy for private oil companies dressed up as foreign policy. But by then, it had served its purpose. Saudi Arabia did not nationalize Aramco. The American companies kept pumping. And in its first year alone, the 50-50 arrangement generated more than $50 million for the Saudi government, a fortune for a kingdom that had been living hand-to-mouth just 2 decades earlier. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of Aramco. Production soared. The company built entire cities in the desert, self-contained American compounds complete with swimming pools, movie theaters, baseball diamonds, and air-conditioned schools where American children attended classes following an American curriculum through 9th grade. These compounds were surrounded by security fences and functioned as little pieces of suburban America transplanted into the Arabian desert. Outside the fences, Saudi workers lived in far more modest conditions. The two worlds existed side by side, separated by chain link and concrete, a physical manifestation of the power imbalance at the heart of the entire arrangement. The company operated like a state within a state. It built roads, hospitals, and desalination plants. It trained Saudi workers slowly and on its own terms, but it trained them. It managed the kingdom's most valuable asset with the efficiency and ruthlessness of a corporation answering primarily to shareholders in New York, not to a king in Riyadh. Aramco's executives communicated regularly with the U.S. State Department, often acting as intermediaries between the Saudi government and Washington. In fact, as one historian noted, Aramco became the chief conduit communicating Saudi Arabia's interests to its parent corporations and to the U.S. government. It was a company performing the functions of an embassy. But the tectonic plates were shifting. In 1960, five oil-producing nations, Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Kuwait, gathered in Baghdad and founded the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. The organization's founding purpose was simple. For too long, Western oil companies had dictated production levels, prices, and profit-sharing arrangements to sovereign nations. OPEC was created to give producing countries collective bargaining power. At first, the organization was weak and largely ignored by the Western majors, but it would not stay that way. The real earthquake came in October 1973, and it shook the entire global order. On October 6th, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise military attack on Israel during the holy day of Yom Kippur. The initial Arab advances caught Israel off guard, and for a few terrifying days it seemed as though the Israeli military might actually be overrun. The United States responded by airlifting massive quantities of weapons and supplies to Israel, a decision that enraged the Arab world. On October 17th, the Arab members of OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia's King Faisal, announced production cuts and an embargo on oil shipments to the United States and other nations that had supported Israel. King Faisal had warned the Americans repeatedly that this would happen. In a meeting in Geneva earlier that year, top Aramco executives had listened as Faisal threatened to withdraw their concession entirely if the U.S. government did not change its stance on the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Americans did not listen, and so the oil weapon was deployed. The effects were devastating. Within months, the price of oil quadrupled from roughly $3 per barrel to nearly $12 per barrel. In the United States, gas stations ran dry. Long lines of cars snaked through neighborhoods. A national 55-mile speed limit was imposed. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created. The entire Western economic model built on the assumption of cheap, abundant oil was thrown into crisis. Inflation soared. Economies stagnated. The term stagflation entered the vocabulary. But the embargo did something else, something more permanent. It shattered the illusion that Western oil companies controlled the global oil supply. The power had shifted irreversibly from the boardrooms of Houston and New York to the royal palaces of Riyadh and Kuwait City, and the Saudis moved to formalize that shift. In 1973, the Saudi government purchased a 25% stake in Aramco. In 1974, they increased that stake to 60%, and in 1980, they acquired 100% ownership. By 1988, the company was formally renamed the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, Saudi Aramco. The Americans were at least on paper out. But were they really? This is the part of the story that almost nobody tells, because the nationalization of Aramco was not like the nationalizations in Iran or Venezuela or Libya. There were no expropriations, no revolutionary guards seizing oil platforms, no angry mobs burning American flags at refinery gates. It was by the standards of resource nationalism, remarkably orderly. The Saudi government compensated the American companies. It retained their technical expertise. It kept the corporate culture, the operational standards, and many of the management practices that the Americans had established over 5 decades. The transition from foreign to Saudi management was gradual, with Saudi nationals progressively assuming executive and technical positions over years, not overnight. And then there was the petrodollar arrangement. In June of 1974, just months after the embargo ended, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh for a series of meetings with King Faisal and senior Saudi officials. What emerged from those meetings was not a formal treaty. It was something more durable, a mutual understanding grounded in convergent self-interest, so powerful that it did not require legal enforcement. The framework had 3 essential components. First, Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars, and it would use its position as OPEC's dominant producer to encourage every other member to do the same. This meant that every nation on earth that needed to import oil would be compelled to hold dollar reserves, creating perpetual global demand for American currency. Second, the accumulated dollar revenues from Saudi oil sales, the petrodollars, would be recycled back into U.S. Treasury securities, U.S. military equipment purchases, and American financial markets. And third, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, weapons, and the implicit guarantee of American power against external threats, whether from the Soviet Union, from Iran, from Iraq, or from internal instability. Now, some scholars and analysts have debated the formal nature of this arrangement. There was no single signed document that said Saudi Arabia must sell oil only in dollars. The practice evolved gradually and was rooted partly in the fact that the dollar was already the dominant international currency and partly in the deliberate architecture that Kissinger constructed. A secret agreement reached in late 1974, not publicly revealed until Bloomberg News obtained the confidential diplomatic cable through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2016, confirmed that the United States had promised military aid and equipment in exchange for the kingdom investing billions of dollars of its oil proceeds in U.S. treasuries. Whatever you call it, deal or understanding or arrangement, the effect was the same. Saudi oil became the foundation of the dollar's global dominance. Every barrel sold in dollars reinforced American financial hegemony. Every petrodollar recycled into treasury bonds funded American government spending. The system was self-reinforcing, elegant, and extraordinarily difficult to disrupt. This is what I mean when I say America never really let go. Yes, the Saudis own Aramco. Yes, they control production decisions. Yes, Saudi nationals run the company. But the architecture of dependency runs both ways and runs deep. Saudi Arabia depends on the United States for military protection in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The kingdom's entire defense apparatus is built around American weapon systems, American training, American logistics. And the United States depends on Saudi Arabia to keep oil priced in dollars, to keep global energy markets stable, and to keep recycling its surplus capital into American financial assets. The modern era has only intensified these entanglements. When Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, commonly known as MBS, announced in January 2016 that he intended to sell shares of Aramco in what would become the world's largest initial public offering, it was presented as the centerpiece of his Vision 2030 plan to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil dependence. The original target was audacious: 5% of the company at a valuation of $2 trillion, raising $100 billion. International listings in New York or London were discussed, but the reality was far messier. International investors pushed back on the $2 trillion valuation. Legal concerns about listing in the United States, particularly related to the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, which could expose the Saudi government to lawsuits related to the September 11th attacks, made a New York listing untenable. The murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in October 2018 further poisoned the international atmosphere. In September 2019, just weeks before the IPO was set to launch, Iranian drones and cruise missiles struck Aramco's Abqaiq processing facility in the Khurais oil field, temporarily knocking out 5.7 million barrels per day of production, roughly 50% of Saudi Aramco's output, and about 5% of global supply. It was the single largest disruption to oil production in history, and it exposed a terrifying vulnerability. The most valuable company in the world, the backbone of the global energy system, could be crippled by a swarm of drones launched from a failed state next door. When the IPO finally went ahead in December 2019, it was scaled back dramatically. Only 1.5% of the company was offered exclusively on the Saudi domestic exchange, the Tadawul. No international listing. The valuation came in at $1.7 trillion, below the MBS target of $2 trillion. The offering raised $25.6 billion, making it the largest IPO in history by a comfortable margin. But it was fundamentally a domestic affair. Foreign institutional investors accounted for only about 10.5% of the book. Gulf allies, wealthy Saudi families, and state-linked entities absorbed the bulk of the offering. Some of those wealthy families, it was reported, had been pressured into investing during a notorious anti-corruption campaign in 2017 that saw hundreds of Saudi elites detained in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh. Today, Aramco remains the most consequential energy company on the planet. It sits on proven reserves exceeding 260 billion barrels of crude oil and 263 trillion standard cubic feet of natural gas. It produces roughly 10 to 12 million barrels of crude oil per day, depending on OPEC plus production agreements. Its production costs are among the lowest in the world, estimated at $3 to $5 per barrel, giving it a structural advantage over every Western oil major and every shale producer in the United States. In 2022, Aramco posted a net profit of $161 billion, the highest annual profit ever recorded by any corporation in history. It pays the world's largest dividend with a base commitment that sends roughly $80 billion per year to the Saudi government through its sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, which holds about 98% of the company. That dividend is the primary funding source for MBS's Vision 2030 gigaprojects, including the $500 billion NEOM development, the Red Sea Tourism Corridor, and the Qiddiya Entertainment City. But beneath the staggering numbers, the fundamental bargain struck on the USS Quincy in 1945 is still recognizable. Saudi Arabia still depends on the United States for its security architecture. American troops are still stationed in the kingdom. American weapons still fill Saudi arsenals. And despite occasional flirtations with China, Russia, and other powers, Saudi oil is still priced and settled in United States dollars. The petrodollar system constructed by Kissinger 50 years ago remains intact, though it is showing cracks. China has been buying increasing quantities of Saudi oil settled in yuan. Saudi Arabia has joined the BRICS bloc of nations that have openly questioned the dollar's dominance. And the United States, now the world's largest oil producer, thanks to the shale revolution, is less dependent on Saudi crude than it was in 1973. But the relationship endures because it was never just about oil. It was about power. It was about the architecture of global finance. It was about ensuring that the world's most important commodity flowed through channels that reinforced American hegemony. From the moment a SoCal geologist hammered the first drill bit into the limestone at Dammam No. 7 in the late 1930s, the fate of Saudi Arabia and the United States became intertwined in ways that neither side fully controlled and neither side could easily undo. What started as a simple concession agreement, a few pages of legal text signed by a desperate king and ambitious oil company, grew into something that reshaped the global order. It created the world's most valuable company. It funded the transformation of a desert kingdom into a modern petrostate. It underpinned the dominance of the American dollar as the world's reserve currency. And it established a template for the relationship between resource-rich developing nations and the industrialized West that persists to this day. The Saudis may own the oil now. They may run the company. They may sit at the head of the OPEC table and wield the power of production cuts and price targets. But the infrastructure of dependence, the military relationships, the financial architecture, the currency conventions, the recycling of surplus capital into American bonds, all of it traces back to that original concession in 1933, to that meeting on the Quincy in 1945, to that secret deal in 1974. America did not conquer Saudi Arabia with armies. It did not need to. It conquered Saudi Arabia with contracts, with tax credits, with security guarantees, and with the quiet, irresistible logic of mutual dependency. And in many ways, it has never let go. The question that hangs over all of this, the question that matters now more than ever, is whether the architecture of the 20th century can survive the pressures of the 21st. The global energy transition, the rise of China, the erosion of trust between Riyadh and Washington, the shale revolution that has made America a net energy exporter. All of these forces are pulling at the threads of a relationship that once seemed unbreakable. Saudi Arabia is diversifying away from oil, at least in theory. The United States is diversifying away from Saudi Arabia, at least in practice. But the petrodollar system, the military relationship, and the fundamental bargain of oil for security continue to shape both nations in ways that are not easily undone. Because the thing about quiet conquest is that it does not end with a treaty or a surrender. It ends only when the system it created is no longer useful to either side. And that day, despite everything, has not yet arrived. If this story changed how you view the hidden gears of global power and the history of the black gold beneath our feet, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Let's plant the seeds of the future together. The next treasure chest of history will be opened soon.